Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to Watch Dan. Today I'll be doing a little comparison of the Mido Multifort 42mm and the 41mm Omega Seamaster Aquaterra. I'm going to do something a little different, and I'm going to start giving watches a score after I review them. So this will be kind of like the pilot for that new system. But I figured these two watches were maybe a good pair to compare because they're kind of similar in some ways. Not a ton of ways, but some of those ways that they are similar. Obviously, they're both Swiss-made watches. They're both a little bit on the larger side. They're both, kind of a gray dial. This one's got kind of this vertical, I don't know if it's really a teak deck so much as it is kind of a corduroy. But they both have stripes. They both have screw down crowns. They both have see-through case backs. And I guess that's kind of where, well, they both have butterfly clasps as well. So that's kind of where the similarities end, to be honest. But there's definitely a lot more differences between these two watches than similarities. But I'll just kind of go over them today. We'll take a look at some of these features, and at the very end of this, we'll give them a Dan score. So I guess I'll start with the Mido. I paid around, I want to say around $700 or $800 for this watch. I can get you an actual figure on the screen here. But it's a Swiss-made watch. It's 42 millimeters diameter. It's a day date. Maybe I'll just take a bunch of good videos of these things for you guys up close, because I already reviewed both these watches. If you want the nitty-gritty, you can go watch those reviews. This is just sort of a compare and contrast. I was really pumped when I first bought this watch because it was my very first Swiss-made watch. After wearing it for a little while, I started to realize that although there was things about it that I thought were much better than my Seikos that were the predecessors to this one, the Seikos are much more comfortable. So that was one of my chief complaints, and still is one of my chief complaints with this watch, is that I just don't find it to be very comfortable. It's a cool watch. It's got a very nice Oyster style bracelet. By all accounts, this clasp should be excellent because it's very similar to most butterfly clasps you see out there, but it just kind of rubs and scratches on your wrist a little bit, and it just doesn't lend itself to being an entirely too comfortable watch. But you can tell with this one, it's all dial. It's 42 millimeters diameter, but it's got a relatively small bezel, and a pretty large dial, and then a really large rehaut around the edge. I'll try to get you a little closer view of that too. So it's an interesting watch. The one that I really wanted actually was the 38 millimeter version of this, but by the time I picked this up, those ones were very hard to find. Actually, I did locate one, but the guy wanted about $1,000 for it, and I just said that's ridiculous for this watch. Especially with all the micro brands out there these days. I know that Mido is a watch with some history. It's been around for quite a long time, probably over a century. So for the historical figures, that's cool. But for what the watch is and what you can get these days for $700 or $800, I don't really feel like the Multifort stacks up. Interestingly enough, this is the only movement I own that actually has, the only watch I own that has an ETA-based movement. This is kind of an ETA 2824 that's been slowed down to 3 hertz, 21,600 beats per hour, I believe. But all my other watches are Solitas, so that is kind of special. It's nice to have at least one authentic ETA movement in your collection. But timekeeping, it's not great. I mean, it's really good. It's not comparable to the Omega, that's for sure. Probably about 7 or 8 seconds fast per day for this watch. But you can see the bracelet's held together by pins and collars. And for this price point, I just don't think that's acceptable. I'm sorry. I think it should be screws holding that thing together. Also, the way this bracelet's constructed, a little bit of a hair puller. I find little hairs getting yanked out of my arm all the time by this watch, and you know, between 22 millimeter lugs, the hair pulling, and just sort of the general discomfort caused by this watch, needless to say, it does not end up on my wrist all that often. I did try to sell this watch a while ago. I was trying to sell it for, I think, around $400, and just there was no takers. So maybe it's not a particularly popular watch, but for now, I'm just gonna hang on to it. You know, I'll wear it to the skate park with my daughter, and no big deal. So that's the 42 millimeter Multifort. And the Challenger is probably my favorite watch. Sorry, camera. Probably my favorite watch in my entire collection. This is the one that sees the most wrist time. Lately, I've been wearing the Jeanneau a lot just because it's such an easy watch to love. But this one's really got a special place in my heart. It's just fantastic. There's a couple things I really like. I love the shape of this case. I like how it tapers in at the bottom. While the Mido Multifort is not particularly comfortable, this watch happens to be extremely comfortable. And though it does not have any micro adjustments, it doesn't really matter. Even if my wrist gets a little swollen, it still just seems to fit perfectly. Maybe I just found the exact right fit for it, but the clasp on this differs from the Mido in that the buttons are on the outside, whereas on the Multifort, the buttons are on the inside. So you can see these little things tend to kind of dig into your wrist. That's not the case here. You just have this nice, polished, kind of soft, rounded swing arm under here, and it sits so comfortably on the wrist. It's very nice. I'll come back to that guy. I don't know how long this video is going to be, guys, but I just really wanted to do a little compare and contrast here. So in case you're in the market, you know, I know there's a huge price difference. I paid about $4,000 for my Omega, which is actually a steal. I got it on Crown and Caliber, and it was on clearance. Typically, these watches are going to go for more like $4,500 to $5,000, but you know, it's a much more expensive watch than the Mido. And is it worth that much more? I guess it's a value proposition you're going to have to try to figure out for yourself. I would say yes. I would say that this Omega lives up to its price tag in pretty much every single way. And I'll show you my Dan score a little bit later so you can see why. But it's just a really, really nice watch. Not only the way that it picks up light, you can kind of see the way it plays with light on those indices and the hands, and even the logo on there. Just, it's got this beautiful like cobalt blue reflection to it. Not only that, but timekeeping. I mean, this thing is, I think it was losing or gaining 1/10 of a second a day. So for almost half a year, I never even had to set this watch. I would just put it, you know, I'd take it off at night, set it down. It would lose a little, or gain a little bit of time, and then I'd wear it all day. It would lose a little bit of time, and then I'd set it down, it'd gain a little time, and it just sort of kind of was static in its timekeeping. And I have to think that that's how Omega designed these watches, with that beautiful caliber 8900 in there. It's just such a nice movement that I think it honestly it's just made to keep time very well. And you know, that's a part of the reason this is a much more expensive watch than the Mido. Obviously, you know, a simple ETA movement. They're nice movements, don't get me wrong, but there's really no comparison in terms of you know, the build quality of the movement and the way it's regulated over time. Some of the differences between these watches, 150 meters water resistant, 100 meters water resistant. This one beats at 3.5 hertz. This one beats at 3 hertz. The screws in the links versus pins and collars in the Omega, or in the Mido rather. The Omega also has female end links, so they swivel real nicely. You get that kind of drooping effect there, where it sort of just drops on your wrist. I mean, if you fold these things in, you can see this is, you know, the lugs stick out further than the links do, versus the Mido, where you have this kind of flared out thing going on here. It doesn't make a huge difference for me because I have pretty big 7.5-inch wrists and big hands, but it does make a difference in the way that it fits. So I guess now would be a good time to do the Dan score. So I'll pop that up on the screen and I'll be right back. Stand by. Okay, so taking a look at my scores. I gave the Omega a 13 out of 15 for the movement. It's an excellent movement, but I do need to leave room at the top for even better movements that I hope to review one day. The Mido gets an 11 out of 15. The ETA is a great movement. It's not anything really particularly awesome, but it is a solid movement that should tick forever without any issues. So it gets an 11 out of 15. For value, I give the Omega an 11 out of 15. I think it's a good value, but you know, if you're spending $4,000 on a watch, it better do something special. And it does keep excellent time, but you know, when you talk value, it's difficult to give a $4,000 watch a high value mark. Now, if I turned around and sold it, I could make all my money back and maybe even make a little bit of a profit off the watch. So that's one thing to consider. But the Mido gets a 10 out of 15 for value. Performance-wise, the Omega is hard to beat. It keeps better time than a lot of my quartz watches, so I gave it a 14 out of 15 for performance, while the Mido is gaining, you know, 7 or 8 seconds a day, so that gets a 10 out of 15. In terms of comfort, the Omega gets an 8 out of 10. It's a very, very comfortable watch, but without having any kind of, you know, micro adjust on there, it's docked a couple points. The Mido gets a 6 out of 10 for comfort. You know, I wanted to give it a 5 out of 10, but I gotta be fair. I can wear the watch, I just don't think it's all that comfortable. For quality, the Omega gets a 9 out of 10. The Mido gets a 7 out of 10. Is there room for the Omega to increase in quality? I mean, maybe. I don't see a whole lot else they could do to make it a higher quality watch than it is. You know, there's just some subtle differences there, like the way that the end links, you know, attached to the watch, for instance. You can see on there, it's a very nice fit and finish. Whereas the Mido, you know, it's a little ragged in between the links and the end links and the lugs. Just a little ragged. You know, there's some spacing in between there. The finishing just isn't quite up to par. For style, I think the Omega probably deserves a 10, but I gave it a 9 because there's got to be a little bit more room at the top there. While the Mido looks very nice, it gets a 7 out of 10. They both get a 9 out of 10 for legibility. Obviously, the Mido's got a massive dial. It's, you know, very easy to read from any angle. But the Omega, the way that it reflects light and just kind of the clean layout, it's also extremely legible. Durability, I gave the Omega a 10 out of 10 and the Mido a 9 out of 10. I feel like the Omega, I said in my last video, if you've never held one, they feel like they're meant to last a lifetime, and they probably are. They're heavy duty watches that just feel extremely solid. So 10 out of 10 for durability for the Omega. 9 out of 10 for the durability for the Mido, because it also feels like a pretty heavy, solid watch. I just don't know. I've heard issues with, you know, winding your ETA movement and slipping a gear or something. So I docked a point there. Lume, the Omega gets a 4 out of 5. I would give it a 5 out of 5 if there was lume on the inside of the minute hand there, but because it only has that little lume tip on there, it can be kind of hard to read at night. So 4 out of 5. While the Mido charges up nicely in the short term, it loses its lume quickly, and after a pretty short period of time, all you can see is the hands. You can't really see the lume on the dial. It almost seems like there's 2-3 times more lume on those hands than there is on the dial, so it doesn't wear evenly as it goes down. So at the end of the day, the Omega gets an 87 out of 100, and the Mido gets a 71 out of 100. So that's the Dan score for these two watches, and I'll be sure to keep a tally of all the watches that I'm reviewing from here on out, so you guys can see how they all stack up against each other. I appreciate you guys watching tonight. I'll finish this up with some lume shots so you can see a comparison there, so stand by and I'll be right back. All right, let's charge them up. I'm going to give the Mido a nice dose of UV light here. Really try to charge it up as much as I can so it's a fair comparison. All right, and now the Omega. Let me flip the lights here. See what we're working with. Huh? I'm actually going to zoom in a little bit more too. It's hard to tell on camera, but the lume on the dial of the Mido is much dimmer than it is on the hands, whereas the Omega is very even all the way around. Like the hands and the indices are all glowing at the same intensity. Whereas with the Mido, the hands are glowing pretty bright, but the dial just really never gets that bright, even if I charge it up with a ton of lume. So I won't sit here all night and bore you with these lume shots, but I think you probably get the idea. But you can see on the Omega how that little minute hand, once it hits, once it's dimmed out after a while and that minute hand hits one of the indices, it really can be difficult to see where it is at nighttime. I kind of have to stare at it for 5-10 seconds to really get an idea what time it is. So while the lume is great, for how much they put on there, I mean, the thing glows all night. It's great quality lume, but it could use just a little bit more on that minute hand for orientation's sake, and maybe a little bit more on the hour hand too, because that's really just a sliver. Somebody commented on my last lume battle, if the hands are hard to read, it doesn't matter how bright the dial is. And that's one point to the Mido, because those hands do stay illuminated for a really good long time, and they're pretty bright, and there's a lot of lume in them. So as long as you can orientate, you can see what time it is at nighttime. So anyways, guys, I really appreciate you watching. Everybody have a wonderful night, and until the next time, bye now.